In the rugged Colorado high country of 1,887, where winter winds carve loneliness into a man's soul, Jonah Ryder had accepted his fate as a hermit. 5 years of solitude in a crumbling line, shack had taught the 62-year-old former trail scout that some hearts are meant to stay buried with the dead. But fate had other plans. Riding home through the twilight, Jonah spotted a figure on the old river bridge, a woman, thin as a rail, gripping the wooden planks with white knuckles. Hester Quinn, 56 and starving, had lost everything that morning when the bank seized her late husband's farm. The swollen spring waters below promised an end to her suffering. What happened next would change 2 broken lives forever. In a matter of hours, they would go from strangers to husband and wife, bound by necessity, but discovering something neither expected to find again. But can 2 souls, weathered by loss and hardship, truly find love when powerful men threaten to destroy their fragile new beginning? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jonah Ryder's calloused fingers traced the worn edge of his wedding ring as he sat on the porch of his half-collapsed line shack, watching the sun paint the Colorado peaks in shades of amber and rose. The gold band had grown loose over the years, much like everything else in his life since Martha passed. 5 winters had come and gone, each one carving deeper lines into his weathered face and settling heavier silence into his bones. The ring had been Martha's idea, bought with the last of their savings in Denver before they'd headed into the high country. A promise, she'd whispered, slipping it onto his finger with hands that trembled from the fever that would claim her 3 weeks later. He'd never taken it off, not even when the metal grew green with age and the memories it carried became too heavy to bear. At 62, Jonah had lived more lives than most men deserved. Born to a farming family in Missouri, he'd left home at 16 with nothing but his father's rifle and a head full of dreams about the Western Territories. The army had shaped him first in years of cavalry service that taught him to read land like other men read books, to find water where there seemed to be none, and to survive in places that broke lesser men. After his discharge, he'd found work as a trail scout, guiding wagon trains and survey parties through the treacherous mountain passes of Colorado Territory. It was honest work that paid well, and more importantly, it kept him moving. He'd never been one to stay still for long, not until he met Martha Holloway at a church social in Colorado Springs. She'd been a widow then, her first husband lost to a mining accident that left her with nothing but debts and a small cabin on the outskirts of town. Martha was 43 to his 55, with steel-gray hair that caught the light like spun silver and hands that knew the value of hard work. She didn't simper or bat her eyes like the younger women who sometimes caught his attention in saloons. Instead, she'd looked him straight in the eye and asked if he planned to spend his whole life running from something, or if he might consider running towards something for a change. They'd married 6 months later, and for 2 precious years, Jonah had learned what it meant to have a home worth returning to. Martha had transformed his restless energy into something purposeful. Together, they'd improved the cabin, planted a garden that somehow thrived despite the harsh mountain climate, and talked long into the nights about their plans for the future. She'd wanted children, though they both knew the years, for that had likely passed them by. Instead, they'd poured their parental instincts into caring for each other and the handful of neighbors scattered throughout their remote valley. When the fever took her, it happened with the swift cruelty that mountain illnesses were known for. One day she was laughing at something he'd said while hanging laundry on the line, and 3 days later she was burning up with a heat that no amount of cool cloths could soothe. The nearest doctor was a 2-day ride away, and by the time Jonah returned with him, Martha was already slipping away. "Promise me," she'd whispered through cracked lips, her hand finding his with the last of her strength. "Promise me you won't disappear into those mountains and never come back. Promise me you'll remember how to live." He'd promised, of course. A man promises anything to ease the suffering of someone he loves. But promises made to the dying often prove harder to keep than promises made to the living. After the funeral, simple affair attended by the 5 other families within a day's ride, Jonah had tried to maintain their home. He'd kept the garden going through that first summer, tended the 2 horses Martha had loved, and even attempted to preserve some of her canning for the winter ahead. But the cabin felt hollow without her laughter, and every familiar object seemed to whisper reminders of what he'd lost. By the second winter, he'd retreated to the old line shack where he'd stayed during his final scouting job, 3 years before he'd met Martha. The one-room structure was barely habitable, a roof partially caved in, chinking fallen out from between the logs, windows covered with oiled paper that did little to keep out the wind. But it was remote enough that he could nurse his grief in solitude, and humble enough that it didn't mock him with memories of happier times. The line shack sat at the edge of a small meadow, surrounded by aspens that turned golden each fall and left him feeling like he was living inside a cathedral of light. A clear stream ran nearby, providing fresh water year-round, and the hunting was good enough to keep him fed. The nearest neighbor was old Heinrich Müller, a German immigrant who'd homesteaded a section of land about 5 miles down the valley. Heinrich had tried to check on him those first few winters, but Jonah had made it clear he preferred his solitude. His daily routine had become as predictable as the sunrise. He'd wake before dawn, tend his small fire, and boil coffee strong enough to strip paint. Breakfast was usually jerky and hardtack, sometimes supplemented with fish from the stream or game he'd shot the day before. Mornings were for hunting or gathering firewood, depending on the season. Afternoons found him reading one of the half-dozen books he'd salvaged from Martha's collection, or working on small repairs to keep the shack marginally habitable. Evenings were the hardest time. That's when the silence pressed in heaviest, when the absence of Martha's voice felt like a physical weight on his chest. He'd taken to talking to himself, sometimes carrying on entire conversations with memories of his dead wife. He knew it wasn't healthy, probably wasn't entirely sane, but it was better than the complete silence that threatened to swallow him whole. The town of Cedar Falls lay 15 miles to the east, connected to his valley by a winding trail that crossed the river at an old wooden bridge. The settlement had grown considerably since Jonah first passed through it 20 years earlier, now boasting nearly 200 residents, a general store, a saloon, a church, and even a small schoolhouse. He made the journey into town perhaps once a month, trading pelts or occasional work for supplies he couldn't hunt, gather, or make himself. The townspeople treated him with the polite distance reserved for harmless eccentrics. They knew his story, Martha's death, was still talked about in hushed tones by the women after church, and they respected his grief even if they didn't understand his self-imposed exile. Store owner Pete Jameson always had his usual supplies ready without being asked: coffee, salt, ammunition, and sometimes a newspaper if one had made it up from Denver. Doc Patterson would nod gravely and ask after his health, though they both knew Jonah would never admit to any ailment that couldn't be cured with willpower and whiskey. It was after one such monthly supply run that fate finally decided to shake Jonah Ryder from his carefully constructed isolation. The spring of 1887 had been particularly wet, with snowmelt swelling the streams and rivers throughout the territory. As he guided his pack horse along the familiar trail home, he could hear the roar of rushing water long before he reached the bridge. The old wooden structure had seen better days built by some long-forgotten trapper or prospector. It consisted of rough-hewn logs, lashed together with rope and prayer. In dry seasons, it spanned what was barely more than a creek. But spring runoff transformed the gentle stream into a torrent of muddy water that crashed against the bridge's supports with enough force to make the entire structure shudder. Jonah paused at the approach to the bridge, studying the swollen river and the way the wooden planks seemed to flex with each surge of water. He'd crossed it in worse conditions, but never without a healthy respect for the power of mountain water in springtime. The river had claimed more than one careless traveler over the years, and their bones likely lay scattered along the rocky canyon walls downstream. It was then, as he sat considering the safest way to cross, that he spotted the figure on the bridge. At first, he thought it might be a trick of the fading light, The sun had nearly disappeared behind the western peaks, leaving the valley in that peculiar twilight that could make shadows seem solid and solid objects appear to waver like smoke. But as his eyes adjusted, there was no mistaking the hunched form clinging to the bridge's rail. The figure was small and slight, dressed in what appeared to be a woman's traveling dress that had seen far better days. She stood at the bridge's center, her back to him, leaning over the rushing water with a stillness that sent a chill down Jonah's spine. Everything about her posture spoke of desperation and finality, the way her shoulders curved inward, the white-knuckled grip on the wooden rail, the terrible patience of someone who had made an irreversible decision and was simply gathering the courage to act on it. Jonah's horse shifted beneath him, sensing his sudden tension. Without fully understanding why, he found himself dismounting and approaching the bridge on foot, his boots echoing hollowly on the wet planks. The woman didn't turn at his approach, didn't seem to hear him over the rush of water below. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice rusty from disuse. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Still no response. He moved closer, noting the way her thin frame seemed to tremble, whether from cold, fear, or something else entirely. He couldn't tell. Her hair, what he could see of it beneath a faded bonnet, was the color of winter wheat, streaked with silver that caught the last rays of sunlight. It was only when he was close enough to touch her shoulder that she finally turned, and Jonah found himself looking into a face that held all the weariness of a life that had demanded more than it had given back. Her eyes, pale blue like high mountain lakes, held depths of exhaustion and despair that he recognized in his own mirror. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rushing water. "Please don't try to stop me." The woman's words hung in the air between them like a prayer whispered in a church that had lost its faith. Jonah studied her face in the dying light, noting the sharp angles where flesh should have curved, the hollow shadows beneath her cheekbones that spoke of weeks without proper meals. But it was her eyes that held him, not just their exhaustion, but the flicker of something else. Relief, perhaps, that someone had finally seen her in what she believed would be her final moments. "I won't stop you," Jonah said quietly, his hands raised slightly to show he meant no threat. "But I wonder if you might tell me your name first. Seems like a person ought to be known before they make such a permanent decision." Her fingers loosened slightly on the rail, and for a terrifying moment he thought she might let go entirely. Instead, she turned more fully toward him, and he could see that her traveling dress had once been a deep green, now faded to the color of old moss. The fabric hung loose on her frame, and there were places where careful mending couldn't quite hide the tears and wear of hard travel. "Hester," she said, her voice barely stronger than before. "Hester Quinn. And you're kind to ask, stranger, but knowing my name won't change what needs doing." Jonah nodded slowly, then surprised himself by settling down onto the wet planks of the bridge, his legs dangling over the edge as if he was simply enjoying an evening by the water. The action seemed to confuse her. Perhaps she'd expected him to try to grab her or to launch into the sort of desperate pleading that people usually offered to those standing on the edge of forever. "Jonah Ryder," he said, introducing himself with the same calm tone he might use to discuss the weather. "And you're right, knowing names doesn't change much. But it does make a person seem more real, doesn't it? Less like something that just happened to wander into a story, and more like someone who belongs in it." Hester's grip on the rail relaxed another degree. She studied his face with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust easily, but also with a curiosity that suggested his unexpected reaction had thrown her off balance. "You're not going to try to talk me out of it?" she asked. "Would it work if I did?" A bitter laugh escaped her lips. No, I don't suppose it would." "Then I reckon I'll save us both the effort," Jonah said. He pulled a piece of jerky from his coat pocket and tore it in half, offering her a portion. "Hungry?" The question seemed to unlock something in her. Her hand moved instinctively toward the offered food before she caught herself, shaking her head. "I couldn't. You don't understand." "I understand you're hungry," Jonah said simply. "I understand you're cold and scared, and probably haven't had a decent meal in longer than you care to admit." I understand that whatever brought you to this bridge tonight feels bigger than anything else in the world right now." He paused, studying the way the rushing water caught the last light. "But I also understand that a hungry person doesn't make the best decisions, and a cold person can't think as clear as they ought to." Hester stared at him for a long moment, then slowly reached for the jerky. Her hands shook as she brought it to her mouth, and she chewed with the careful restraint of someone who knew that eating too quickly after going without could make you sick. But even that small amount of food seemed to bring some color back to her pale cheeks. "There," Jonah said, pulling a worn blanket from his pack and shaking it out. "Now we can have a proper conversation." "About what?" Hester asked, but she didn't resist when he draped the blanket around her shoulders. "About whatever you want to talk about why you're here, if you feel like sharing, about why I'm here, if you're curious, about the weather, or the way the water sounds, or anything else that comes to mind." He settled back against the bridge's railing, making it clear he wasn't in any hurry to leave. "Time's one thing I've got plenty of these days." For several minutes, they sat in silence. The river rushed beneath them, and somewhere in the distance, a night bird called to its mate. Hester pulled the blanket closer around her shoulders, and Jonah noticed that some of the terrible tension had gone out of her posture. "They took my farm today," she said finally, her voice so quiet he had to lean forward to hear her over the water. "The bank said my husband's debts were more than the land was worth, and they couldn't wait any longer for payment." Jonah didn't respond immediately, sensing that she needed to let the words come at their own pace. "Thomas died 6 months ago," she continued, her hand moving to touch something at her throat, a small silver locket that caught the faint starlight. "Fever, like so many others last winter. He was a good man, but not much of a farmer. Always had ideas about making our fortune, but never quite managed to turn those ideas into anything that would pay the bills." The locket was obviously precious to her, the way she clutched it unconsciously as she spoke. Jonah had seen enough grieving people to recognize the gesture holding onto the last physical connection to someone who had been everything to them. "I tried to keep things going after he passed," Hester said. "Worked the land as best I could, took in washing and mending from the neighbors. But there were debts I didn't even know about, and the bank had been patient longer than they should have been, I suppose." "Where did you go when they took the farm?" Jonah asked gently. "Nowhere to go," Hester said with a shrug that tried to convey indifference but only highlighted her desperation. "Thomas's family never approved of me, said he married beneath his station. My own family's all gone now, scattered or dead. I spent last night in the church, but Pastor Williams made it clear that charity has its limits, especially for a woman alone." The picture was becoming clearer now, and it was a familiar one in the hard country of the Colorado Territory. People arrived with hopes and dreams, worked themselves to the bone trying to make those dreams real, and sometimes found that the land demanded more than they had to give. The lucky ones had family to fall back on, or skills that could earn them a living in town. The unlucky ones ended up standing on bridges in the dark, measuring the distance to the water below. "So you came here," Jonah said. "I walked for hours trying to think of some other choice," Hester replied. "But there isn't one, is there? I'm 56 years old, Mr. Ryder. Too old to start over, too poor to buy passage anywhere else, and too proud to beg for charity that would just keep me alive long enough to face the same choice again next month." She opened the locket with careful fingers, revealing a tiny photograph of a man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Thomas Quinn had been handsome in a quiet way, with the sort of face that suggested he'd been better at dreaming than at the practical business of staying alive. "He would have hated this," she said, looking down at the photograph. "Thomas always believed things would work out somehow, said the Lord never gave a person more than they could handle. Maybe the Lord figured you could handle more than this," Jonah suggested carefully. Hester closed the locket with a soft click. Or maybe the Lord stopped paying attention. They sat in silence again, and Jonah found himself thinking about Martha's final wordship plea that he remember how to live. He'd spent 5 years failing to keep that promise, retreating further and further from any connection to the world or the people in it. But sitting here beside this desperate woman, he felt something stirring that he'd thought was buried with his wife. "I've got a cabin," he said suddenly, the words surprising him as much as they seemed to surprise her. "Just a line shack, really, but it's warm and dry. There's food and a decent bed, and nobody around to ask questions or make judgments." Hester turned to stare at him. "Why would you offer that to a complete stranger?" "Maybe because I know what it's like to lose the person who made life worth living," Jonah said. "Maybe because I made a promise once that I haven't been very good at keeping, and this feels like a chance to do better." "I can't pay you," Hester said, her voice tight with suspicious hope. "Didn't ask you to. And I can't. I mean, if you're expecting—" "I'm not expecting anything except maybe some company for a while," Jonah said. "Gets quiet up in the mountains. Sometimes a man forgets how to talk to another human being." Hester studied his face in the dim light, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because some of the wariness left her expression. "How do I know you're not just another kind of danger?" she asked. "You don't," Jonah admitted. "But you get to choose your dangers, and it seems to me like taking a chance on a stranger who offers food and shelter is a better gamble than trusting that water down there to solve your problems." The river roared beneath them, and Hester looked down at it, as if seeing it clearly for the first time. The current was vicious, full of debris and foam, carrying chunks of ice and fallen trees with casual violence. It would be a hard death, and probably not a quick one. "Just until I can figure out what to do next," she said finally. "Just until then," Jonah agreed. He stood slowly, offering her his hand. After a moment's hesitation, she took it, her fingers cold and thin but surprisingly strong. Together, they walked back toward solid ground, leaving the bridge and its dark promise behind them. As they reached his horse, Hester paused and looked back at the rushing water. "I don't know why you stopped," she said quietly. "Neither do I," Jonah replied, and realized it was the truth. "But I'm glad I did." He helped her onto the horse behind him, noticing how light she felt, as if the weeks of hunger had made her insubstantial. She wrapped her arms around his waist to keep from falling, and he could feel the way she trembled from cold, from exhaustion, from the emotional aftermath of stepping back from the edge of everything. The ride to his cabin took the better part of an hour, following a winding trail that climbed steadily through stands of pine and aspen. Hester didn't speak during the journey, but he could feel her gradually relaxing against his back as they put distance between themselves and the bridge. Whatever came next, at least they had bought themselves time to figure it out. Neither of them could have predicted that by morning they would be married. The line shack looked even more humble in the pale light of dawn than it had when they'd arrived in darkness. Jonah watched from the doorway as Hester took in her surroundings with the careful assessment of someone who had learned to quickly evaluate any new situation for potential dangers or advantages. The one-room structure was spartanly furnished: a rough-hewn table, two mismatched chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, and a stone fireplace that dominated one wall. His few possessions were arranged with military precision. Books stacked neatly on a shelf he'd built into the wall, cooking implements hanging from wooden pegs, clothes folded in a battered trunk that had seen him through 10 years of army service. "It's not much," Jonah said, filling the coffee pot from a bucket of stream water, "but it keeps the weather out." Hester nodded, still clutching the blanket around her shoulders like armor. In the morning light, he could see just how thin she'd become. Her wrists were barely thicker than a child's, and her collarbone stood out sharp against the worn fabric of her dress. But there was strength in the way she held herself, a dignity that poverty and desperation hadn't managed to break. "I'll sleep outside," she said quietly. "I don't want to put you out of your bed." "Won't hear of it," Jonah replied, stirring the coals in the fireplace back to life. "Bed's yours as long as you need it. I've slept on worse than a blanket by the fire." The offer seemed to make her uncomfortable, and he realized she was struggling with the implications of accepting charity from a man she'd known for less than 12 hours. In the harsh social landscape of 1887, A woman alone with a man was presumed to be either his wife, his whore, or his victim. There weren't many other categories that respectable society recognized. "Mr. Ryder," she began, her voice carefully formal, "I appreciate your kindness more than you know, but I can't help wondering what people will think." "Not many people around here to think anything," Jonah said, though he understood her concern. "Nearest neighbor is old Heinrich Mueller, and he minds his own business. Next closest is probably 15 miles away." But even as he said it, he knew the isolation that had been his refuge for 5 years would work against them now. Word traveled fast in small communities, especially when it concerned the moral conduct of their members. If anyone discovered that a strange woman was living alone with the hermit Jonah Ryder, the assumptions would be swift and unforgiving. As if summoned by his thoughts, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the trail outside. Jonah and Hester both froze, exchanging a look that acknowledged the precariousness of their situation. Through the single window, Jonah could see a familiar figure approaching Pastor Williams from the Cedar Falls Church, riding a sturdy bay gelding that picked its way carefully up the rocky path. "Stay inside," Jonah murmured to Hester, then stepped out onto the cabin's small porch to greet his unexpected visitor. Pastor Williams was a man of middle years and considerable girth, with the kind of florid complexion that suggested he enjoyed his meals and didn't stint on the sacramental wine. He was well-meaning but prone to the sort of moral certainty that made him feel responsible for the spiritual welfare of everyone within a 50-mile radius, whether they wanted his guidance or not. "Jonah," the pastor called out as he dismounted, his breathing labored from the climb. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I felt compelled to check on you. There's been some talk in town about a woman." "Pastor," Jonah interrupted, keeping his voice level despite the warning bells going off in his head. "What brings you all the way up here?" Williams tied his horse to the post Jonah had driven into the ground for that purpose, then turned to face him with the expression of a man preparing to deliver difficult news. "Mrs. Abernathy was in the store yesterday evening when you rode through town. She mentioned seeing a woman with you, someone she didn't recognize." Jonah should have known that Agnes Abernathy would be the source of trouble. The woman had appointed herself the unofficial moral guardian of Cedar Falls, and she had an eagle eye for anything that might constitute scandalous behavior. If she'd seen Hester, even briefly, it would have been all over town by morning. "I offered assistance to someone in need," Jonah said carefully. "Didn't realize that was cause for concern." "Of course not. Of course not," Williams said, mopping his forehead with a handkerchief despite the cool morning air. "But you must understand, Jonah, how it looks. A woman, alone with a man who isn't her husband, well, it raises questions about propriety." The irony wasn't lost on Jonah that a man of God was more concerned with appearances than with the fact that he'd likely saved a woman's life. But he also understood the realities of frontier society. A woman's reputation was often all she had, and once lost, it was nearly impossible to recover. "What exactly are you suggesting, Pastor?" Jonah asked. Williams shuffled his feet, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation, but feeling duty-bound to continue. "The circuit judge is due back in 3 weeks. If this woman is to remain in the area, perhaps arrangements could be made." 3 weeks is a long time," Jonah said quietly. "Yes, well, there are other options," Williams continued, warming to his theme. "Mrs. Henderson might be willing to take in a boarder, or perhaps we could arrange for her to work for one of the families in town." "Pastor Williams." The voice came from behind Jonah, soft but carrying clearly in the morning air. Both men turned to see Hester standing in the doorway, her chin raised and her pale eyes steady despite the obvious exhaustion that still marked her features. "Mrs. Williams began, then faltered, realizing he didn't know her name. "Quinn," Hester said, stepping fully onto the porch. "Hester Quinn, lately of Copper Creek, and I believe you and I need to have a conversation." She moved with the careful grace of someone who had been raised to understand the importance of proper behavior, and despite her worn clothing and obvious poverty, there was something in her bearing that commanded respect. Williams, caught off guard by her directness, fumbled for words. "Mrs. Quinn, I meant no offense." "None taken," Hester replied calmly. "But I think we should address the situation honestly. You're concerned about propriety, and rightly so. Mr. Ryder has shown me Christian kindness when I was in desperate need, and I won't have his reputation suffer for it." Jonah felt a surge of admiration for her composure. In her position destitute, dependent on a stranger's charity, and facing the judgment of a community she barely knew, most people would have been defensive or apologetic. Instead, she was taking control of the conversation. "I'm sure we can find a suitable arrangement," Williams said, his relief evident. "There are Christian families in town who would be willing to help a woman in need." "For how long?" Hester asked. "A week? A month? And what then?" "I have no family, Pastor Williams. No money, no property, and no skills that would allow me to earn a living wage. How long do you suppose Christian charity will sustain me before it becomes a burden that even the most generous soul finds difficult to bear?" The question hung in the air between them, and Jonah could see Williams struggling to find an answer that didn't sound callous. The truth was that frontier communities were often stretched thin, and while they might help a neighbor through a temporary crisis, permanent dependence was a luxury few could afford. "Perhaps," Williams said slowly, "if you were to consider marriage, there are several widowers in the area who might be willing to take on a charity case," Hester finished. "A woman past her childbearing years, with nothing to offer but the promise not to be a burden on the community." The pastor's silence was answer enough. Hester turned to look at Jonah, and he saw something in her eyes that he recognized, the look of someone who had reached a decision that would change everything. "Mr. Ryder," she said formally, "would you be willing to marry me?" The question caught both men completely off guard. Williams sputtered something about hasty decisions and proper courtship, but Jonah found himself studying Hester's face, looking for signs of desperation or calculation. Instead, he saw a woman making a practical choice with clear eyes and a steady heart. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Because you're a good man who's shown me kindness without expecting anything in return," she replied. "Because you understand loss and wouldn't expect me to pretend grief I don't feel or love I don't have. Because a marriage of convenience serves us both. You get companionship and someone to help maintain your home, and I get security and respectability." It was a logical proposal, the kind of practical arrangement that was common on the frontier, where survival often trumped romance. Jonah had seen dozens of such marriages during his years as a scout, partnerships born of necessity rather than passion, but often growing into something deeper over time. "The circuit judge," Williams began, "can marry us when he returns," Hester said, never taking her eyes off Jonah. "But if we're to avoid scandal, the engagement should be announced immediately. And if propriety demands it, we can arrange for temporary supervision until the ceremony." She had thought it through quickly and thoroughly, mapping out the social navigation required to transform a potentially scandalous situation into something respectable. Jonah found himself impressed by her practical intelligence and her willingness to take charge of her own fate. "Well," he said slowly, "I reckon that makes sense." Williams looked between them with the expression of a man who had come to solve one problem only to find himself witness to the creation of an entirely different situation. "This is all very sudden." "Pastor," Jonah said, his voice carrying a note of finality, "are you willing to announce our engagement to the congregation this Sunday?" The older man studied their faces, perhaps looking for signs that this was some kind of ruse or desperate scheme. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, because he nodded slowly. "If you're both certain this is what you want," he said, "but I strongly suggest a period of courtship." 3 weeks should be sufficient," Hester said, "assuming, of course, that suitable arrangements can be made for propriety's sake during that time." And just like that, the course of both their lives had been set in motion. As Williams prepared to leave, promising to make the necessary arrangements for a chaperone and to speak with the congregation about the upcoming union, Jonah found himself marveling at how quickly everything had changed. Less than 24 hours ago, he had been a hermit content with his solitude. Now he was an engaged man, committed to sharing his life with a woman he barely knew. It should have terrified him. Instead, for the first time in 5 years, he felt like he might actually have a future worth living. The arrangements Pastor Williams made were both practical and awkward. Mrs. Prudence Mackenzie, a stern widow in her 70s who served as the church's unofficial keeper of moral standards, arrived the following morning with a carpet bag and a disapproving expression that suggested she viewed the entire situation as highly irregular. She set up her temporary residence in the line shack's only corner that offered any privacy space, barely large enough for a bedroll and a traveling trunk, separated from the main room by a blanket hung on a rope. 3 weeks, she announced to both Jonah and Hester, as if the timeline had been her idea rather than theirs. 3 weeks to determine if this arrangement is suitable, and not a day longer. Hester accepted the supervision with grace, understanding that Mrs. Mackenzie's presence was the price of respectability. But Jonah chafed at having his solitude invaded by someone who clearly considered him a potential threat to virtue. The older woman watched his every interaction with Hester with the vigilance of a guard dog, making meaningful throat-clearing sounds whenever she felt their conversation was becoming too familiar. It was during the second day of this arrangement that Hester made a discovery that changed everything. She had been helping Jonah organize his meager possessions partly to demonstrate her domestic usefulness to Mrs. Mackenzie's watchful eyes, and partly because inactivity made her restless. While cleaning out a corner where years of accumulated debris had gathered, she found a cedar chest that had been pushed against the wall and forgotten. "What's in here?" she asked, running her hands over the smooth wood. Jonah looked up from the harness he was mending, and she saw his face tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. "Martha's things," he said quietly. "Probably should have dealt with them years ago." The chest was beautifully made, with careful dovetail joints and a brass lock that had tarnished with age. When Jonah produced the key from his pocket, a small thing that he'd apparently carried with him all these years, the hinges opened with barely a whisper. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that still held the faint scent of lavender, was Martha Ryder's wedding dress. Hester lifted it from the chest with reverent hands, marveling at the fine workmanship and the obvious care that had gone into its creation. The dress was made of ivory silk, with tiny pearl buttons down the back and delicate lace trim at the collar and cuffs. It was clearly expensive, the sort of dress that represented months of saving for a couple of modest means. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "She wore it once," Jonah said, his voice thick with memory. "Said she wanted to save it for special occasions, but we never seemed to find one special enough." Mrs. Mackenzie had been pretending not to listen, but Hester could see the older woman's attention sharpen at the sight of the dress. In the moral arithmetic of frontier society, a wedding dress carried almost mystical significance. It represented not just a woman's most important day, but her commitment to the sacred institution of marriage itself. "She was about your size," Jonah observed, though he seemed to be speaking more to himself than to Hester. The implications of the statement hung in the air like incense. Hester understood what he was suggesting, and also what he couldn't quite bring himself to say directly. The dress represented his first marriage, his great love, his most profound loss. Offering it to her would be both a practical gesture and a symbolic a way of acknowledging that their upcoming union, while born of necessity, deserved the dignity of proper ceremony. "I couldn't," Hester said, though her fingers continued to stroke the silk with unconscious longing. "It wouldn't be right." "Martha would have wanted it to be used," Jonah said firmly. "She always said it was a sin to let beautiful things go to waste." Mrs. Mackenzie cleared her throat, a sound they had both learned to interpret as commentary on the propriety of whatever was happening. "It's customary for a bride to wear white," she said with grudging approval, "shows respect for the sacrament." Over the next several days, as they waited for the circuit judge to return, Hester found herself trying on the dress in the privacy of the space behind Mrs. Mackenzie's blanket partition. The fit was nearly perfect, requiring only minor alterations that she was able to make with the sewing kit she'd salvaged from from her former life. But more than the practical considerations, wearing Martha's dress felt like accepting a mantle of responsibility. She was not just marrying Jonah Ryder, she was becoming the keeper of his memories, the guardian of a love story that had been cut short by tragedy. The weight of that responsibility was both humbling and frightening. As she worked on the alterations by lamplight, Hester found herself thinking about the woman who had worn the dress before her. Martha Ryder existed in the line shack like a ghost made of everyday objects, a hairbrush still holding strands of silver hair, a pair of reading glasses folded carefully in a case, a Bible with passages marked in a woman's careful handwriting. "Tell me about her," Hester said one evening, as she and Jonah sat by the fire, Mrs. Mackenzie having retired early with complaints about the mountain air affecting her rheumatism. Jonah was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with remembrance. "She laughed at everything," he said. Not because she thought the world was particularly funny, but because she said laughter was the only thing that made the hard parts bearable. She could find something to smile about, even when we were down to our last dollar and didn't know where the next meal was coming from. He paused, poking at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up toward the smoke-darkened ceiling. She was practical too, never met a problem she couldn't figure out some way to solve, even if the solution wasn't what you'd call conventional. One winter, when the snow was too deep to get to town for supplies, she taught herself to make soap from wood ash and bacon grease. Stuff was so strong it could take the hide off a buffalo. But it worked. Hester smiled at the image. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was," Jonah agreed. "Never could understand what she saw in a broken-down old scout like me." "Maybe she saw the same thing I see," Hester said quietly. He looked at her with surprise, as if the possibility hadn't occurred to him. "What's that?" "A good man who's been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders for so long, he's forgotten he doesn't have to carry it alone." The words seemed to settle something between them, not love, exactly, but a kind of understanding that might, in time, grow into something deeper. They were both damaged people, scarred by loss and disappointment, but perhaps those very scars would help them understand each other in ways that undamaged people never could. The day before the circuit judge was scheduled to arrive, Mrs. Mackenzie announced that she was satisfied with the propriety of their arrangement and would be returning to town to prepare for the wedding ceremony. Her departure left Jonah and Hester alone together for the first time since that night on the bridge, and the silence that followed felt different from the companionable quiet they had shared under supervision. "Are you certain about this?" Jonah asked as they sat down to their evening meal, a simple stew made from venison and wild onions, but seasoned with herbs that Hester had found growing near the stream. "Are you?" she countered. "I asked first." Hester considered the question seriously, as she seemed to consider most things. "I'm certain that I want to live," she said finally. "A week ago, I wasn't sure about that. I'm certain that you're a decent man who deserves better than the loneliness you've been living with. And I'm certain that whatever we build together will be better than what either of us had before." It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was honest. And honesty seemed more valuable than passion when you were talking about spending the rest of your life with someone. "Then I guess we're getting married," Jonah said. "I guess we are." That night, Hester tried on Martha's wedding dress one final time, standing before the small mirror that Jonah had mounted on the wall near the wash basin. The woman looking back at her was still thin, still marked by the hardships of recent months, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there since Thomas's death, spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind her. She thought about the locket she still wore, with Thomas's photograph inside, and wondered if it was wrong to marry one man while still carrying the image of another. But then she remembered something Pastor Williams had said during one of his visits. "The heart's not like a house with only one room. It can hold more than one person, each in their own space." Tomorrow, she would become Mrs. Jonah Ryder. She would wear a dead woman's dress and make promises to a man she barely knew, hoping that necessity might, in time, transform into something resembling contentment. It wasn't the life she had planned, but then, very little in life went according to plan. At least this time, she was making the choice herself, stepping into uncertainty with her eyes open and her chin raised. As she carefully hung the dress on a peg near the door, preparing for what might be her last night as Hester Quinn, she found herself thinking about the bridge where Jonah had found her. Less than 2 weeks ago, she had been ready to let the rushing water carry her away from all her troubles. Now she was preparing to marry a man who had shown her that even the deepest despair could be transformed into something like hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new uncertainties, and the weight of promises that would bind her to this remote mountain cabin and the solitary man who had made it his refuge. But tonight, for the first time in months, Hester fell asleep without wondering if she wanted to wake up in the morning. Judge Cornelius Whitmore arrived in Cedar Falls on a Tuesday morning in April, his traveling court consisting of a weathered wagon, a tired horse, and a law clerk who looked young enough to be his grandson. The wedding ceremony took place in the church at 2 o'clock that afternoon, witnessed by a handful of townspeople who had come more out of curiosity than celebration. Hester stood at the altar, wearing Martha's wedding dress, which fit her as if it had been made for her frame. The ivory silk caught the light streaming through the church's single stained glass window, and despite the circumstances that had brought them to this moment, she looked every inch the proper bride. Jonah, standing beside her in his best shirt and the black suit he'd worn to Martha's funeral, seemed overwhelmed by the solemnity of the occasion. The ceremony itself was brief and practical. Judge Whitmore read the traditional vows in a voice that suggested he'd performed hundreds of such ceremonies, and both bride and groom responded with quiet dignity. When Jonah slipped a simple gold band onto Hester's finger, a ring he'd purchased that morning from the general store, his hands were steady despite the magnitude of what they were doing. "You may kiss your bride," the judge intoned, and for a moment, both Jonah and Hester seemed frozen by the intimacy the moment demanded. Then Jonah leaned forward and pressed his lips gently to hers, a chaste kiss that sealed their legal union without presuming emotional attachment they didn't yet share. Walking back up the aisle as husband and wife felt surreal to both of them. They had entered the church as two desperate people making a practical arrangement and emerged as partners bound by law and social expectation to make a life together. The handful of witnesses offered polite congratulations, but Hester could sense the underlying curiosity in their voice. Everyone wondered what would become of this unlikely marriage between the hermit and the destitute widow. The ride back to the line shack was accomplished in companionable silence, both of them processing the reality of their new situation. Mrs. Mackenzie had prepared a simple wedding supper before departing, leaving covered dishes that filled the cabin with the scent of roasted chicken and fresh bread. It was a gesture of acceptance that moved Hester more than she had expected. "Well, Mrs. Ryder," Jonah said as they shared their first meal as husband and wife, "I suppose we should talk about how this is going to work." The formality of using her new name felt strange to both of them, but also significant. Hester Quinn had died on that bridge 2 weeks ago. The woman sitting across from him was someone new, someone who had chosen life and partnership over despair and solitude. "I don't expect this to be a conventional marriage," Hester said carefully. "I understand that what we have is an arrangement of mutual benefit, not a romance." Jonah nodded, but something in his expression suggested the topic was more complicated than either of them wanted to acknowledge. "We'll take things as they come," he said finally. "No pressure, no expectations beyond basic respect and partnership." Over the following weeks, they settled into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Hester proved to be an excellent housekeeper, transforming the Spartan line shack into something that actually felt like a home. She mended Jonah's clothes, organized his few possessions, and cooked meals that reminded him what food could taste like when prepared with care and attention. More importantly, she proved to be good company. During the long mountain evenings, they sat by the fire and shared stories of their past lives. Hester talked about her childhood in Ohio, her first marriage to a man who had been kind but ineffectual, and her dreams of making a life in the Colorado Territory. Jonah found himself telling her about his years as a scout, the places he'd seen, and the people he'd guided through the treacherous mountain passes. It was during one of these conversations that Hester first noticed the collection of hand-drawn maps that Jonah kept rolled up in a leather tube near his bed. The maps were works of art in their own right, detailed drawings that showed not just the obvious landmarks and trails, but also water sources, seasonal grazing areas, mineral deposits, and the subtle variations in terrain that could mean the difference between life and death for travelers. "You drew all of these?" she asked, unrolling one that showed the area around their valley in extraordinary detail. "Part of the job," Jonah said, but she could hear the pride in his voice. "Army taught me surveying and cartography. After my discharge, I kept making maps of every new territory I scouted. Never knew when the information might be useful." Hester studied the intricate notations that covered the map elevation markers, seasonal water levels, notes about game trails and winter shelters. It was clear that Jonah possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the Colorado high country, accumulated over decades of careful observation and methodical record-keeping. "This is remarkable," she said, tracing the path of the stream that ran near their cabin. "You've mapped areas that most people have never even seen." "Territory's changing fast," Jonah observed. "Railroads coming through, bringing settlers and miners and all kinds of folks who don't know the first thing about surviving up here. These maps might help some of them avoid making fatal mistakes." It was then that Hester began to understand something important about her new husband. Beneath his hermit's exterior was a man who cared deeply about the land and the people who traveled through it. His self-imposed isolation hadn't been born of misanthropy, but of grief had withdrawn from the world, not because he didn't care about it, but because caring had become too painful. As spring progressed into early summer, Hester found herself looking forward to their evening conversations with genuine anticipation. Jonah was an excellent storyteller, with a dry sense of humor that emerged gradually as he became more comfortable with her presence. He told her about guiding a family of eastern greenhorns who had tried to cross a mountain pass in their Sunday clothes, or the time he'd helped a survey crew locate a missing supply cache by reading signs in the landscape that they couldn't even see. For his part, Jonah was discovering that having a partner changed everything about daily life in ways both small and profound. Meals became social occasions rather than fuel stops. Chores that had seemed burdensome when performed alone became opportunities for companionship. Even the silence felt different when it was shared with someone else. But it was more than just practical companionship. Hester brought a perspective to their conversations that challenged him to think about things differently. She asked questions that made him examine assumptions he'd held for years, and she listened to his answers with the kind of attention that made him feel like his thoughts and experiences mattered. One evening in late May, as they sat watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Hester made an observation that would prove prophetic. "Someone's been watching the valley," she said quietly, nodding toward a distant ridge where a glint of sunlight had caught her eye. Jonah followed her gaze and immediately spotted what she had seen, the brief flash of reflection that could only come from glass or metal, probably field glasses or a surveyor's instrument. Someone was observing their remote valley, and doing so with equipment that suggested more than casual interest. "How long have you been seeing that?" he asked. 3 days now, always around sunset," Hester replied. "Different positions along the ridge, but always with a clear view of our cabin and the surrounding area." Jonah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. In his years as a scout, he'd learned to recognize the signs of systematic surveillance, and what Hester was describing fit the pattern perfectly. Someone was conducting a careful reconnaissance of their valley, gathering information for purposes unknown. "Could be hunters," he said, though he didn't believe it himself. "Could be," Hester agreed, but her tone suggested she didn't believe it either. That night, Jonah dug out his old field glasses and positioned himself where he could watch the ridge without being easily spotted in return. Sure enough, just as the sun was setting, he caught sight of movementa figure with surveying equipment, methodically documenting something about their valley. The next morning, he saddled his horse and rode up to investigate the site where the watcher had been positioned. What he found there made his blood run cold. The remains of a surveyor's camp, complete with transit marks and measurement stakes. Someone was mapping their valley with the kind of precision that suggested official business. More troubling still, he found fresh horse tracks leading away from the site, multiple horses, shod with the kind of expensive ironwork that suggested wealthy owners. This wasn't some lone prospector or casual landlooker. This was an organized operation with significant resources behind it. When he returned to the cabin, Hester took one look at his face and knew something was seriously wrong. "What did you find?" she asked. "Trouble," Jonah replied, pulling out one of his own maps and spreading it on the table. "Someone's surveying our valley, and they're being mighty careful about it. That usually means they're planning something that won't benefit the people already living here." Hester studied the map, noting the way Jonah had marked water sources, mineral deposits, and potential transportation routes. What kind of something? Could be mining claims, could be railroad survey, could be land speculation, Jonah said grimly. None of it good for folks like us who prefer to be left alone. As if summoned by their conversation, the distant sound of hoofbeats echoed from the trail leading to their cabin. Multiple horses, moving at a steady pace that suggested official business rather than social calls. Jonah and Hester exchanged a look that acknowledged their peaceful interlude was about to end. Whatever had brought surveillance to their valley was now coming directly to their door, and they were about to discover whether their marriage of convenience was strong enough to withstand the kind of pressure that destroyed lives and shattered communities. Through the window, they could see a group of 6 riders approaching, led by a man in an expensive suit who carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. Behind him rode men who looked less like businessmen and more like the kind of hired muscle that wealthy people employed when legal persuasion wasn't sufficient. "Mrs. Ryder," Jonah said quietly, "I think we're about to find out exactly what those maps are worth." The man in the expensive suit dismounted with the practiced ease of someone who spent considerable time on horseback despite his obvious wealth. He was perhaps 50 years old, with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that suggested he was accustomed to having his way in most situations. His companions remained mounted, their hands resting casually near their weapons, in a manner that was meant to appear relaxed but actually conveyed a clear threat. "Mr. Ryder, I presume?" the man said, approaching the cabin with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "My name is Cornelius Blackwood. I represent certain business interests in Denver, and I'd like to discuss a proposition that might be of mutual benefit." Jonah stepped out onto the porch, positioning himself between the visitors and the cabin door, where Hester waited. He'd dealt with enough powerful men during his years as a scout to recognize the type, someone who believed that money and influence could solve any problem, and who employed violence when more civilized methods failed. "Mr. Blackwood," Jonah replied evenly, "I'm not in the habit of conducting business with strangers who arrive unannounced with armed escorts." Blackwood's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. "A reasonable precaution in country like this. My associates are here for my protection, nothing more. As for my business, I represent a consortium of investors who are interested in acquiring property in this area for development purposes." "Not interested in selling," Jonah said flatly. Now, Blackwood said, raising a placating hand. "You haven't even heard my offer yet. I'm prepared to pay quite generously for your claim to this valley, far more than you could make from farming or ranching such remote property." "Still not interested." Blackwood's facade of geniality began to crack slightly. "Mr. Ryder, I don't think you understand the scope of what's happening in this territory. The railroad is coming through, bringing civilization and commerce. Property values are going to change dramatically, and those who position themselves wisely stand to profit considerably." "And those who don't?" Hester asked, stepping out onto the porch beside her husband. Blackwood's attention shifted to her, and Jonah didn't like the calculating way the man's eyes moved over her face and figure. "Mrs. Ryder, I presume? A lovely woman like yourself deserves better than this primitive existence. My offer would allow you and your husband to relocate somewhere more suitable to civilized living." "We're quite civilized here, thank you," Hester replied with ice in her voice. Are you? Blackwood asked, his tone suggesting doubt. Living in a cabin without proper amenities, isolated from society and culture. Surely you must occasionally long for the comforts that money can provide: proper housing, fine clothes, the company of refined people. It was a calculated insult, designed to make Hester feel ashamed of her circumstances and eager to escape them. But Blackwood had misjudged his audience. Hester had learned the difference between poverty and simplicity, between isolation and solitude. The life she was building with Jonah might be humble, but it was honest and peaceful qualities that no amount of money could guarantee. Mr. Blackwood, she said with deadly politeness, I believe my husband has already given you his answer. Perhaps you should respect that and be on your way. The businessman's mask slipped further, revealing the ruthless calculation beneath. Mrs. Ryder, I'm afraid you don't understand the realities of the situation. This entire valley has been targeted for development, whether current residents cooperate or not. My clients have considerable influence with territorial authorities, and there are various legal mechanisms that can be employed to secure necessary property rights. Such as? Jonah asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Eminent domain, for one, Blackwood replied smoothly. If this land is needed for railroad right of way or other public improvements, individual property rights become secondary to the greater good. There are also questions of proper legal title homestead claims that haven't been properly filed, survey discrepancies that might invalidate existing deeds, tax obligations that haven't been met. The threat was clear enough. Blackwood's consortium had the resources to tie them up in legal proceedings that could drag on for years, bankrupting them long before any final resolution was reached. Even if they ultimately prevailed, the cost of fighting would likely exceed any benefit of winning. And if we refuse to cooperate with these legal mechanisms? Hester asked. Blackwood shrugged eloquently. Accidents happen in remote country like this, fires, sometimes, wolves, unfortunate encounters with claim jumpers or desperados. The territorial authorities do their best, but they can't be everywhere at once. One of his mounted companions shifted in his saddle, and Jonah caught the glint of afternoon sunlight on metal. These weren't just business associates, they were hired guns, the kind of men who made their living solving problems that couldn't be resolved through legal channels. I see, Jonah said quietly. And what exactly does this development plan involve? Mining, primarily, Blackwood said, apparently believing he was making progress. Our geological surveys indicate significant mineral deposits throughout this region. With railroad access, extraction would become economically viable on a large scale. Jonah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Large-scale mining meant hydraulic operations, chemical processing, and environmental destruction that would transform their pristine valley into a wasteland of poisoned streams and barren hillsides. Everything that made this place worth living in would be destroyed in the pursuit of profit. How long do we have to consider your offer? Hester asked. I'm a reasonable man, Blackwood replied. Shall we say 2 weeks? That should give you sufficient time to discuss the matter and reach a sensible decision. It wasn't really a timeline for consideration, it was an ultimatum. 2 weeks to accept his terms or face the consequences of refusing to cooperate with forces beyond their ability to resist. After Blackwood and his men departed, Jonah and Hester sat in their cabin and tried to process what they'd just experienced. The peaceful life they'd been building together was under attack from enemies with virtually unlimited resources and no scruples about how they achieved their goals. Can they really do what they're threatening? Hester asked. If they've got political connections in Denver, probably, Jonah admitted. Territorial law tends to favor development over individual property rights, especially when there's serious money involved. Hester was quiet for a long moment, studying the deed to her former farm that she'd retrieved from her few possessions. The document was water-stained and creased from travel, but still legally valid at least in theory. There's something I haven't told you, she said slowly, about my farm and why the bank was so eager to foreclose. Jonah waited, sensing that whatever she was about to reveal would be significant. Thomas wasn't just a poor farmer, Hester continued. He was a poor farmer sitting on top of what might be a very valuable piece of property. The last surveyor who looked at our land said there were signs of silver deposits in the hills behind our house. Did the bank know about this? I think they might have, Hester said. The foreclosure happened awfully fast, and they didn't seem interested in negotiating or finding alternative arrangements. Almost like they wanted me gone for reasons that had nothing to do with the debt. A horrible possibility was beginning to take shape in Jonah's mind. Hester, where exactly was your farm located? She described the location, and Jonah felt his stomach drop as he recognized the area. According to his maps, her former property was situated directly in the path of the most logical railroad route through the Territoria route that would connect the mining areas to transportation networks and make large-scale extraction profitable. They've been planning this for longer than we thought, he said grimly. Your foreclosure wasn't about debt, it was about clearing title to property they needed for their development scheme. Can we prove that? Maybe, Jonah said, pulling out his collection of maps and spreading them across the table. If we can show that the foreclosure was part of a larger pattern of land acquisition along the projected railroad route, it might be evidence of conspiracy. They spent the evening examining Jonah's detailed maps and cross-referencing them with what they knew about recent property transfers in the region. A disturbing pattern emerged. Farms and homesteads along the most logical transportation corridor had been changing hands at an unusual rate, often under circumstances similar to Hester's forced sale. Look at this, Hester said, pointing to a series of notations on one of the maps. Every one of these properties has been sold or foreclosed within the past year. That can't be coincidence. It's not, Jonah agreed. Someone's been systematically clearing title to land they need for their railroad and mining operations. The question is whether we can do anything about it. As they worked by lamplight, analyzing the evidence of what appeared to be a massive conspiracy to defraud homesteaders of their property rights, Jonah found himself marveling at his wife's intelligence and determination. The desperate woman he'd found on the bridge had been transformed into a formidable partner, someone who could analyze complex problems and develop strategic responses. We need help, Hester said finally. Whatever we do, we can't do it alone. Blackwood's people have too many resources and too much political influence. What kind of help? Jonah asked. Legal help, for one thing. Someone who understands territorial law and can challenge these foreclosures in court. And maybe federal help if this involves railroad fraud. That might be a federal crime. It was a sensible strategy, but it would require them to leave their mountain retreat and venture into the political complexities of territorial governance. More immediately, it would require them to survive the next 2 weeks while Blackwood's people waited for their answer. There's something else, Jonah said quietly. If we're going to fight this, we need to be prepared for them to escalate beyond legal threats. Those men riding with Blackwood weren't lawyers. Hester nodded, understanding the implication. What do you suggest? Jonah moved to the corner where he kept his old army equipment, pulling out a wooden crate that he hadn't opened in years. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a cavalry saber that had seen service in a dozen frontier campaigns. The weapon was perfectly maintained, despite its age, the steel bright and the edge keen. I suggest we make sure they understand that we're not helpless victims, he said, lifting the saber and testing its balance. Sometimes the only thing bullies understand is the prospect of resistance that might cost them more than they're willing to pay. As Hester watched her husband handle the weapon with obvious familiarity and skill, she realized that the quiet mountain hermit she'd married was far more formidable than his gentle demeanor suggested. Jonah Ryder had been a soldier before he became a scout, and soldiers knew how to fight for things worth protecting. For the first time since Blackwood's visit, she felt a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to protect the life they were building together. 3 days after Blackwood's visit, Hester made a discovery that changed everything they thought they knew about their situation. She had been exploring the valley more thoroughly, partly to better understand the land they were fighting for, and partly because restless energy made sitting still impossible. It was during one of these walks that she noticed something odd about the boundary markers that dotted the landscape. The markers were metal stakes driven deep into the ground, with surveyors' symbols carved into their tops. Most appeared to be standard boundary markers of the type used to delineate property lines and territorial divisions. But one stake, positioned near the creek that formed the eastern boundary of their valley, bore markings that were different from all the others. Instead of the usual survey notations, this stake was inscribed with a complex series of numbers and letters that looked more like a mining claim designation than a boundary marker. Curious, Hester used a piece of paper to make a rubbing of the inscriptions, then returned to the cabin to show Jonah what she'd found. "This isn't a property boundary," Jonah said after studying the rubbing carefully. "This is a mineral rights claim, filed with the Territorial Mining Office." "What does that mean?" "It means someone has already staked a legal claim to whatever minerals might be under our land," Jonah explained grimly. "If this claim is valid, they have the right to extract those minerals, regardless of who owns the surface property." The implications were staggering. Even if they successfully fought off Blackwood's attempts to acquire their land through legal maneuvering or intimidation, the mining consortium would still have the right to tear up their valley in pursuit of whatever mineral wealth lay beneath it. "Who filed the claim?" Hester asked. Jonah studied the markings more carefully, deciphering the bureaucratic code that identified the claim's legal owner. What he found made his blood run cold. "Rocky Mountain Development Corporation," he said, "filed 18 months ago before either of us ever set foot in this valley." "Before my husband died," Hester said quietly. "Before my farm was foreclosed. Before any of this started." The timeline was impossible to ignore. Someone had been planning this operation for far longer than they'd realized, methodically positioning themselves to control both the surface rights and the mineral rights to vast tracts of Colorado territory. The foreclosures, the intimidation, the offers to buy out remaining property owners, all of it was just the final phase of a conspiracy that had been years in the making. "We need to see what other claims have been filed," Jonah said. "If there's a pattern to this, it might help us understand the full scope of what we're dealing with." The trip to the Territorial Mining Office in Denver would take the better part of a week, but they both understood it was necessary. More than that, it would get them away from the valley during a period when Blackwood's patience might be wearing thin and his methods might be becoming more direct. They left the next morning, traveling light and avoiding the main roads where possible. Jonah's knowledge of the backcountry trails proved invaluable, allowing them to make good time while staying out of sight of anyone who might be watching for them. Denver had grown considerably since Jonah's last visit, transformed from a rough frontier town into something approaching a real city. The mining office was housed in a substantial brick building near the center of town, staffed by clerks who seemed overwhelmed by the volume of paperwork generated by the territory's booming mineral extraction industry. It took most of a day to gain access to the claim records they needed, but what they found there was even worse than they'd feared. Rocky Mountain Development Corporation had filed mineral rights claims covering nearly 100 square miles of Colorado territory, including not just their valley, but most of the surrounding region. The claims were all perfectly legal, filed through proper channels and accompanied by the necessary documentation and fees. More troubling still was the pattern of surface property acquisition that accompanied the mineral claims. In area after area, small farmers and homesteaders had lost their land through foreclosure, tax liens, or forced sales, always to buyers who turned out to be fronts for the same development consortium. "Look at this," Hester said, pointing to a series of entries in the ledger. "Every one of these foreclosures happened within 6 months of the mineral claims being filed. They identify valuable mineral deposits, then systematically force out anyone who might interfere with extraction." "It's legal," the clerk explained when Jonah asked about the relationship between the mineral and surface rights. "Territorial law gives mineral rights precedence over surface rights when it comes to extraction activities. Property owners are entitled to compensation for damages, but they can't prevent legitimate mining operations. Even if those mining operations destroy their homes and livelihoods. Even then, the clerk confirmed, development takes precedence over individual property rights. That's how the territory grows and prospers. It was a rigged system, designed to benefit large-scale developers at the expense of individual settlers. The law might be on the books to protect small property owners, but in practice, it served the interests of whoever had enough money and political influence to work the system to their advantage. That evening, as they sat in a Denver boarding house and tried to process what they'd learned, Hester made an observation that would prove crucial to everything that followed. "There's something that doesn't make sense about the timing," she said, studying the copies of documents they'd obtained from the mining office. These mineral claims were filed 18 months ago, but Blackwood's geological surveys of our valley only started 3 weeks ago. Why would they wait so long to confirm what minerals are actually there? It was a good question, and the more Jonah thought about it, the more troubling it became. If the development consortium had already invested the time and money necessary to file legal claims to mineral rights, why would they need to conduct additional surveys unless there was something about the situation that they didn't fully understand? Maybe they filed claims based on incomplete information, he suggested, staked out a large area based on general geological surveys, then started doing detailed exploration to figure out which parts were actually worth developing. Or maybe, Hester said slowly, they're not just looking for minerals. The possibility had occurred to both of them, but neither had wanted to voice it directly. What if the real value of their valley wasn't in whatever gold or silver might lie beneath the surface, but in something else, entirely, something that would make it worth whatever the consortium was spending to acquire it? The next morning, they visited the Territorial Railroad office to examine maps and surveys related to planned transportation routes. What they found there answered their questions and raised new ones that were even more disturbing. According to the most recent railroad surveys, the proposed Denver and Western line would run directly through their valley, following the natural corridor formed by the creek and the surrounding hills. But more than that, the valley would serve as the intersection point for 2 separate rail lines, one running east to west through the mountains, and another running north to south along the foothills. "It's not about mining," Hester breathed, studying the railroad maps with growing understanding. "It's about transportation. Our valley is going to be a major railroad hub, which means everything else, the mineral claims, the foreclosures, the intimidation, is just to clear the way for something much bigger," Hester finished. A railroad hub would transform their remote valley into a bustling commercial center, complete with rail yards, maintenance facilities, hotels, warehouses, and all the other infrastructure needed to support a major transportation network. The consortium wasn't just planning to extract minerals from the area, they were planning to build an entire city. Property that was currently worth perhaps a few $100s would become worth hundreds of thousands once the railroad arrived. Anyone who controlled large tracts of land along the proposed route stood to make an enormous fortune, while anyone who didn't would find themselves displaced by the march of progress. "No wonder Blackwood was so confident about using legal mechanisms to force us out," Jonah said grimly. "If the railroad gets territorial approval for eminent domain, they can seize whatever property they need and pay compensation based on current agricultural value, not future commercial potential. Can we stop it?" Jonah studied the railroad maps, noting the dates and approval signatures that accompanied the various survey documents. Something about the paperwork struck him as odd, though he couldn't immediately identify what was bothering him. "Maybe," he said finally, "but not through legal channels. This has too much political support and too much money behind it." "Then how?" It was Hester who provided the answer, pointing to a detail on the railroad survey that Jonah had initially overlooked. "Look at this," she said. The survey was conducted by Morrison and Associates, but it's signed off on by the Territorial Railroad Commissioner. So Morrison and Associates is one of the companies listed as a partner in Rocky Mountain Development Corporation, Hester explained. The same people who surveyed the railroad route are the ones who filed mineral claims along that route. They're basically surveying for themselves, then getting territorial approval for their own plans. It was a clear conflict of interest, the kind of political corruption that could potentially invalidate the entire development scheme if properly exposed. But it would also require them to take on not just a private consortium, but territorial officials who were either complicit or incompetent. "We need help," Jonah said. "More help than we can find in territorial government." "Federal help? Maybe. If we can prove that territorial officials are colluding with private developers to defraud property owners, that might be something the federal authorities would be interested in." It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. The alternative was to accept Blackwood's offer and hope that the consortium would honor their promises once they no longer needed to worry about resistance from displaced property owners. As they prepared to return to their valley, armed with information that made their situation seem both more hopeless and more potentially winnable than before, Hester made one final observation that would guide everything they did next. "They're not going to wait much longer," she said. "If Blackwood gave us 2 weeks to consider his offer, that means they're planning to move forward with or without our cooperation. Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it soon." The surveyor's marker that had started their investigation now seemed like a monument to their naivety. They had thought they were dealing with a simple land grab motivated by mineral extraction. Instead, they had uncovered a conspiracy that involved territorial officials, railroad companies, and development corporations working together to transform the entire region according to their own commercial interests. Fighting such a conspiracy would require resources, allies, and strategies that they didn't currently possess. But as they rode back toward their valley, both Jonah and Hester understood that they no longer had the luxury of choice. They could surrender and hope for the best, or they could fight and risk losing everything. The metal stake with its cryptic markings had revealed the true scope of what they were up against. Now they had to decide whether they were brave enough or desperate enough to take on forces that seemed far beyond their ability to resist. They returned to their valley to find that Blackwood's men had not been idle during their absence. Fresh horse tracks crisscrossed the meadow around their cabin, and someone had driven additional surveyor's stakes into the ground with military precision. More ominously, several of Jonah's traps had been deliberately sprung, and someone had scattered the contents of his woodpile as if searching for something hidden beneath the logs. "They've been here every day," Hester observed, reading the signs with eyes that had learned to see the landscape the way Jonah did. Multiple riders, spending hours at a time examining the property. "Looking for what?" Jonah wondered aloud. "Evidence that we're not the simple mountain folk we pretend to be," Hester suggested. "Or maybe they're trying to intimidate us by showing how easily they can invade our privacy." The psychological warfare was effective. Knowing that armed strangers had been roaming freely around their home while they were gone made the cabin feel less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. Every shadow could conceal a watcher. Every sound could herald the approach of enemies. But more than fear, the violation sparked anger in both of them. This was their home, their life, their chosen refuge from a world that had already taken too much from them. The fact that Blackwood's people felt free to treat it as their personal playground was an insult that demanded response. That evening, as they sat by their fire and planned their next moves, Jonah made a decision that would have been unthinkable just a few months earlier. He went to his old trunk and withdrew not just the cavalry saber, but also a gun belt that held a Colt revolver he hadn't worn since his scouting days. "I haven't carried this in 5 years," he said, checking the weapon's action with the automatic precision of long training. "Hoped I'd never need to again." The gun was perfectly maintained despite its long storage, the metal bright and the mechanism smooth. Hester watched as her husband strapped on the gun belt, noting how the simple act seemed to transform him from a gentle mountain hermit into something altogether more formidable. "You think it will come to that?" she asked. "I think Blackwood's people respect only one thing," Jonah replied grimly. "The possibility that their actions might have consequences they're not prepared to pay." Over the next few days, they implemented a series of defensive measures that turned their peaceful valley into something resembling a military camp. Jonah's years of army service and frontier scouting had taught him lessons about security that proved invaluable now. He identified observation posts that commanded views of all the approaches to their cabin, established escape routes that would allow them to disappear into the mountains if necessary, and created caches of supplies that would sustain them if they were forced to abandon their home. More importantly, he began teaching Hester skills that no respectable frontier wife was supposed to need. She learned to shoot the rifle with accuracy that surprised them both, mastered the use of field glasses for surveillance, and absorbed lessons about reading terrain and weather that could mean the difference between life and death in hostile country. "You're a natural scout," Jonah observed as she demonstrated her growing ability to move silently through the forest. "Got the patience for it, and the eye for detail." "Thomas always said I was too curious for my own good," Hester replied. "Guess there are worse qualities to have." Their defensive preparations were interrupted on the fourth day by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Heinrich Müller, their nearest neighbor, rode into their valley looking haggard and frightened in a way that immediately put both of them on alert. "They came to me yesterday," the old German said without preamble. "3 men in expensive clothes, asking questions about you and your woman." "What kind of questions?" Jonah asked. "How long you've been here, whether you have legal title to the land, whether you've been showing signs of wealth that might indicate mineral discoveries." Heinrich replied, "I told them nothing, but they made it clear that my cooperation would be remembered favorably when development comes to the valley." "Did they threaten you directly?" "Not in so many words," Heinrich said, "but they mentioned that accidents happen to people who interfere with progress, and that my own property might be subject to review if questions arose about my citizenship status." It was a sophisticated intimidation campaign designed to isolate Jonah and Hester by making their neighbors afraid to associate with them. Heinrich was a naturalized citizen, but his thick accent and German birth made him vulnerable to the kind of bureaucratic harassment that could destroy a man's life, even if it never resulted in formal charges. "What do you want to do?" Jonah asked. "I want to fight," Heinrich said with quiet determination. "My family came to America to escape men like these men, who believe that power gives them the right to take whatever they want from those who cannot resist. I will not run again." It was the beginning of something that Blackwood's people had probably not anticipated: organized resistance from the very people they had expected to intimidate into submission. Heinrich's decision to stand with them transformed their situation from a private struggle into something approaching a community effort. Over the following days, other neighbors began arriving at their cabin to share information and coordinate responses to the increasing pressure from Blackwood's organization. There was Mary Pemberton, a widow who had been offered an insultingly low sum for her small ranch; Jake Morrison, a prospector who had been told his mining claims would be reviewed for compliance issues; and Tom Chen, a Chinese immigrant whose market garden supplied vegetables to half the territory, but whose legal status made him vulnerable to deportation threats. Each had been approached by representatives of the Development Consortium, and each had been offered the same basic choice: cooperate and receive modest compensation, or resist and face legal and financial ruin. The pattern was clear and systematic, designed to clear the entire region of inconvenient property owners who might interfere with the grand development plan. "They're moving faster than we expected," Hester observed as they listened to their neighbors' stories. "Blackwood said we had 2 weeks to consider his offer, but they're already pressuring everyone else in the area." "Because they know we went to Denver," Jonah said grimly. "They're afraid we might have learned something that could interfere with their timeline." The realization that their investigation had been detected added urgency to their planning. If Blackwood's people knew they had been gathering evidence about the conspiracy, it was only a matter of time before more direct measures were employed to silence them. It was Tom Chen who provided the information that transformed their defensive preparations into something approaching a real strategy for resistance. As someone who conducted business throughout the territory, He had heard rumors about similar development schemes in other areas, rumors that suggested the Rocky Mountain Development Corporation was just one part of a much larger network of companies engaged in systematic land fraud. "There's a federal marshal in Colorado Springs," Tom said. "Marshal Samuel Hayes. Word is he's been investigating reports of territorial corruption related to railroad development. If we could get our evidence to him—" "If we could get to him alive," Jonah corrected. "Colorado Springs is 3 days' ride, and Blackwood's people will be watching the roads." "Not all the roads," Heinrich said with a smile that suggested he had been thinking about this problem. "I know trails through the mountains that haven't been used since the fur trappers left. Difficult for horses, impossible for wagons, but passable for someone who knows the way." It was risky, but it was also their best chance of getting federal authorities involved before Blackwood's people escalated to open violence. The evidence they had gathered in Denver, combined with testimony from multiple property owners about the systematic intimidation campaign, might be enough to trigger a federal investigation. "Who goes?" Hester asked. "I do," Jonah said immediately. "I know the country, and I've dealt with federal marshals before. They're more likely to take the complaint seriously if it comes from someone they can verify has legitimate credentials." "No," Hester said firmly. "We go together, or we don't go at all." It was the first time she had directly contradicted him on a matter of strategy, and Jonah was surprised by the steel in her voice. But as he considered the alternatives, he realized she was right. Leaving her alone in the valley would make her a target for retaliation, while bringing her along would demonstrate their commitment to seeing the fight through together. "Together, then," he agreed. "But we leave tonight, before Blackwood's people realize what we're planning." The next few hours were spent in frantic preparation for a journey that would be dangerous under the best of circumstances and potentially suicidal if they were detected. Heinrich provided detailed directions for the mountain trails that would keep them away from the main roads, while their other neighbors agreed to maintain surveillance of the valley and send warning if Blackwood's people appeared to be preparing for immediate action. As they packed supplies for the journey, Hester noticed that Jonah was making preparations that went far beyond a simple trip to Colorado Springs. He cleaned and loaded not just his revolver but also his rifle, packed extra ammunition, and selected equipment that would be useful for extended wilderness survival. "You're planning for more than a 3-day trip," she observed. "I'm planning for the possibility that we won't be coming back here for a while," Jonah admitted. "If Hayes takes our complaint seriously, he might want us to stay in Colorado Springs as witnesses. If he doesn't, we might need to disappear into the mountains until we can figure out another approach. And if Blackwood's people catch us on the trail—" Jonah's hand moved unconsciously to the cavalry saber at his side. "Then we make sure they understand that some fights cost more than they're worth." As they prepared to leave their cabin in the darkness before dawn, both Jonah and Hester understood that they were crossing a line from which there would be no return. They were no longer simply defending their home. They were taking the offensive against forces that had the resources to destroy them completely if they chose to do so. But they were also no longer the desperate strangers who had met on a bridge just a few months earlier. They had become partners in the truest sense, bound together by shared danger and common purpose. Whatever happened on the trails ahead, they would face it as a team. The cavalry saber at Jonah's side caught the light of their oil lamp as he made final adjustments to his equipment. The weapon had served him faithfully in a dozen frontier campaigns, and now it would serve him again in a different kind of Warawa, for the right to live peacefully in a place they had chosen to call home. As they slipped out into the pre-dawn darkness, following trails that would keep them hidden from watching eyes, both of them knew that the next few days would determine not just their own fate, but the fate of everyone who had chosen to stand with them against the forces of organized greed and political corruption. The fight for their valley was about to begin in earnest. The journey to Colorado Springs took 4 days instead of 3, following mountain trails that tested both their endurance and Heinrich's memory of routes he hadn't traveled in 20 years. They moved mostly at night, hiding during daylight hours in caves and dense forest that would conceal them from casual observation. Twice they spotted riders on the main roads below, and once they had to wait motionless for hours while a search party passed within 50 yards of their hiding place. Marshal Samuel Hayes proved to be exactly the kind of federal officer they had hoped to find. A career lawman with a reputation for integrity and a particular interest in the kind of political corruption that was undermining territorial governance. When Jonah and Hester finally reached his office in Colorado Springs, exhausted and trail-worn but carrying a carefully organized collection of documents and testimony, Hayes listened to their story with the attention it deserved. "This is serious," he said after reviewing their evidence. "If even half of what you're alleging is true, we're looking at a conspiracy that involves not just private fraud, but corruption of territorial officials." The land office records they had copied in Denver, combined with the systematic pattern of foreclosures and intimidation their neighbors had documented, painted a picture of organized criminal activity that extended far beyond simple business competition. Hayes was particularly interested in the conflict of interest they had discovered between the Railroad Survey Company and the mining consortium. Morrison and Associates has been involved in 3 similar schemes in other territories, Hayes revealed. "We've been building a case against them for months, but we needed evidence of direct coordination between their surveying activities and fraudulent mineral claims." "So you'll investigate?" Hester asked. "I'll do more than investigate," Hayes replied grimly. "I'll organize a federal raid on their operations, starting with the Rocky Mountain Development Corporation's offices in Denver. If we can seize their records before they have a chance to destroy evidence, we might be able to unravel this entire network." It was more than they had dared hope for, but it also meant they would be in even greater danger once Blackwood's people realized what was happening. Federal intervention would threaten not just the Valley Development Scheme, but potentially expose criminal activity across multiple territories. "How long before you can move?" Jonah asked. 2 days to organize the raid and coordinate with local authorities who aren't compromised," Hayes said. "But that means you and your neighbors need to hold out until we can gather the evidence we need to make arrests. 2 days might as well have been 2 months if Blackwood decided to resolve the situation through direct action rather than legal maneuvering. But they had committed themselves to this course, and backing down now would only delay the inevitable confrontation. "We'll manage," Jonah said with more confidence than he felt. Hayes studied them both, noting the weapons they carried and the hard-earned competence that showed in the way they held themselves. "You're not planning to just hide in the mountains until this blows over, are you?" "No," Hester said firmly. "We're going back to defend our home." The marshal nodded approvingly. "Good. Running would just convince them they can intimidate anyone who opposes them. But be careful, these people have already shown they're willing to use violence when legal methods don't work." As they prepared to return to their valley, Hayes provided them with something almost as valuable as federal intervention, official documentation that validated their right to be where they were and what they were doing. The papers he gave them established their status as federal witnesses in an ongoing investigation, which meant that any harm that came to them would be a federal crime rather than a local matter. "Keep these documents safe," Hayes warned. "They might be the only thing standing between you and a shallow grave if Blackwood's people decide to escalate." The return journey was even more dangerous than the trip to Colorado Springs had been. They had been gone for nearly a week, and Blackwood's patience with their absence would be wearing thin. Worse, their investigation might have been discovered, which would make them targets for immediate elimination rather than gradual pressure. They approached their valley from the north, using a route that would allow them to observe their cabin from a distance before committing to a direct approach. What they saw through Jonah's field glasses made both of them curse under their breath. Their cabin was surrounded. At least a dozen men were positioned around the valley, some watching the approaches, while others searched the cabin and surrounding buildings with systematic thoroughness. These weren't the business associates who had accompanied Blackwood on his earlier visit. These were professional gunmen, armed and positioned like soldiers preparing for battle. "They know we went to the federal authorities," Hester whispered. "Question is whether they know we succeeded," Jonah replied, studying the deployment of men around their property. "If they think we're still gathering evidence, they might be planning to wait for our return. If they know Hayes is already organizing a raid, they'll try to eliminate us before we can testify, Hester finished. As they watched, a familiar figure emerged from their cabin. Cornelius Blackwood himself, accompanied by two men who had the look of professional killers. The businessman was no longer maintaining his facade of civilized negotiation. His body language spoke of frustration and barely controlled anger. He's not used to people who don't collapse when he applies pressure, Jonah observed. What do we do? It was a question that went to the heart of who they had become during their brief marriage. They could retreat to the mountains and wait for federal authorities to resolve the situation, protecting themselves while abandoning the home they had built together. Or they could fight for what was theirs, accepting the risks that came with direct confrontation. We go get our property back, Jonah said, his hand moving to check the cavalry saber at his side. Against a dozen armed men? Against however many it takes, Jonah replied. This is our home, Hester, our life. If we let them drive us out now, we'll spend the rest of our days running from the next group of people who decide they want what we have. It was a moment that defined not just their strategy but their relationship. Hester could have argued for caution, could have pointed out the overwhelming odds they faced and the sensible alternatives available to them. Instead, she checked her own weapons and nodded grimly. Then we'd better make sure we do this right, she said. They spent the rest of the day conducting reconnaissance and developing a plan that would maximize their advantages while minimizing their exposure to superior numbers. Jonah's knowledge of the terrain was crucial, identified positions that would allow them to observe and harass Blackwood's men while remaining mobile enough to avoid being pinned down and overwhelmed. More importantly, he recognized that their greatest asset wasn't their weapons or their tactical knowledge, but their legal status as federal witnesses. As long as they remained alive and able to testify, Blackwood's entire operation was in jeopardy. That gave them leverage that went beyond anything they could achieve through simple violence. We're not trying to kill them all, Jonah explained as they prepared for what would essentially be a guerrilla campaign against superior forces. We're trying to survive long enough for Hayes to complete his investigation and make arrests. Every hour we cost them is an hour closer to federal intervention. And if they decide the risk is too great and try to eliminate us quickly, then we make sure that eliminating us costs them more than they're prepared to pay, Jonah said, his fingers moving to the worn grip of his cavalry saber. As darkness fell over their valley, Jonah and Hester prepared to reclaim their home from the forces that had invaded it. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing enemies with resources that far exceeded their own. But they were fighting for something that Blackwood's men couldn't understand: the right to live peacefully in a place they had chosen to call home. The land office records Hayes would need for his federal case were hidden in their cabin, along with documentation that could expose the entire conspiracy. Retrieving those documents would require them to penetrate the defensive perimeter that Blackwood's men had established around their property. More than that, it would require them to demonstrate that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. The attack began at midnight with a rifle shot that shattered the silence of the mountain valley and sent Blackwood's sentries scrambling for cover. Jonah had positioned himself on a ridge overlooking their cabin, using his knowledge of the terrain to find a spot that offered both a clear field of fire and multiple escape routes. His first shot was deliberately aimed to wound rather than kill a message that the valley's rightful owners had returned and would not be intimidated. "Ryder," Blackwood's voice echoed across the darkness, "you're surrounded. Come down and we can discuss terms." The response was another rifle shot, this one close enough to Blackwood's position to send him diving for cover behind a water trough. Jonah had no intention of negotiating with men who had invaded his home and threatened his wife. This was going to be settled on his terms, using methods he understood far better than his enemies did. While Jonah kept the gunman pinned down with carefully placed shots from his elevated position, Hester moved through the darkness toward the cabin where their crucial documents were hidden. She had become surprisingly adept at moving silently through the forest, and her smaller size allowed her to use cover that would have been inadequate for a larger person. The cabin's interior had been thoroughly searched, with furniture overturned and personal belongings scattered across the floor. But Blackwood's men had been looking for obvious hiding places under floorboards, behind loose stones, inside furniture. They had missed the careful concealment that Jonah had constructed inside the chimney, protected from fire by a metal box and accessible only to someone who knew exactly where to look. Hester retrieved the documents and was preparing to retreat when she heard footsteps approaching the cabin. One of Blackwood's men had broken away from the group, responding to Jonah's sniper fire, and was moving to secure the building. She pressed herself against the wall beside the door, holding her breath as the gunman stepped into the cabin. The man was clearly nervous, his weapon held ready as he searched the shadows for any sign of the cabin's owners. He moved with the careful precision of someone who had done this kind of work before, but his attention was focused on the obvious hiding places rather than the possibility that someone might already be inside. When he passed close enough, Hester struck with the knife Jonah had taught her to use, driving the blade between his ribs with precision that surprised them both. The man dropped without a sound, and she dragged his body into the corner where it would be less likely to be discovered immediately. Outside, Jonah's harassment campaign was achieving its intended effect. Blackwood's men were spread out across the valley, trying to locate a sniper who seemed to be able to see them clearly while remaining completely invisible himself. Every time they moved from cover, another rifle shot would force them back, and every attempt to organize a coordinated assault was disrupted by precisely placed bullets. "He's got to be on the ridge," one of the gunmen called out. "Johnson, take 3 men and circle around behind him." But Jonah had anticipated such tactics, and he had prepared accordingly. As the flanking party began their climb toward his position, they triggered a series of traps he had constructed from materials found around the cabin tripwires, connected to piles of loose rocks that would create noise and confusion, deadfalls designed to injure rather than kill, and false positions that would draw fire away from his actual location. The mountain warfare techniques he had learned during his army service were proving their worth against enemies who were accustomed to intimidating farmers and storekeepers rather than fighting trained soldiers. Every advantage of numbers and equipment that Blackwood's men possessed was negated by Jonah's superior knowledge of the terrain and his experience in this kind of combat. "This is pointless," Blackwood shouted into the darkness. "We know you went to the federal authorities. Hayes is already dead, and his investigation died with him." It was a lie designed to demoralize them, but it had the opposite effect. If Blackwood felt the need to claim that Marshal Hayes was dead, it meant the federal investigation was proceeding exactly as planned. Their job was to survive long enough for that investigation to reach its conclusion. Hester used the distraction created by Blackwood's shouted lies to make her way back toward Jonah's position, carrying the documents that would prove the extent of the conspiracy once federal authorities could examine them. But as she moved through the forest, she realized that the battle was about to escalate in ways that none of them had anticipated. Additional riders were approaching the valley, at least 6 men, moving fast and carrying enough firepower to end the stalemate through sheer overwhelming force. Blackwood had called for reinforcements, and the new arrivals would have the numbers and equipment necessary to root Jonah out of his defensive position. She reached his hiding place just as the new gunmen began deploying around the base of the ridge, their coordination and equipment marking them as professional soldiers rather than hired thugs. "We need to go," she whispered. "Now, while we still can." "The documents." She patted the leather pouch where she had secured the crucial papers. "Safe, but there are too many of them now, and they know what they're doing." Jonah studied the deployment of forces below them, recognizing tactical competence that would make his current position untenable within minutes. The new arrivals were already identifying his most likely escape routes and positioning themselves to cut off his retreat. "The North Trail," he said quietly. "Heinrich's route to his cabin, if we can reach it before they complete their encirclement." They moved through the darkness with the desperate silence of people who understood that discovery meant death. Behind them, Blackwood's reinforcements were beginning their assault on the ridge, using covering fire and coordinated movement that would have overwhelmed any position held by a single defender. But Jonah was no longer there to be overwhelmed. He and Hester were already moving through terrain that his enemies couldn't see clearly, following paths that existed more in memory than on any map. The mountains that had been his refuge for 5 years were now his salvation, offering sanctuary to those who understood their moods and dangers. They reached Heinrich's cabin just as the first grey light of dawn was beginning to touch the eastern peaks. The old German was waiting for them with hot coffee and a grim expression that suggested he had been listening to the gunfire echoing from their valley. "How many?" he asked without preamble. "At least 18, maybe more," Jonah replied. "Professional gunmen, not just intimidation specialists." "Then they mean to finish this permanently," Heinrich observed. "Question is whether Hayes can move fast enough to matter." As if summoned by his words, the sound of multiple horses approaching at a gallop echoed from the trail leading to Heinrich's property. For a moment, all 3 of them tensed, expecting Blackwood's men to have tracked them to their refuge. Instead, the riders who emerged from the forest wore the uniforms of federal marshals, led by Samuel Hayes himself. "Sorry we're late," Hayes called out as he dismounted. "Had to coordinate with military authorities before we could move. Are you all right?" "We are now," Hester replied, producing the documents that would provide the evidence Hayes needed to complete his case. "Good," Hayes said grimly, "because we're about to arrest everyone involved in this conspiracy, starting with Cornelius Blackwood and his entire organization." As federal marshals prepared to descend on the valley where Blackwood's men were still searching for enemies who were no longer there, Hester found herself holding a handful of soil from the land she and Jonah had fought to protect. The earth was dark and rich, nourished by mountain streams and seasons of careful tending. It was more than just dirt, it was proof that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the odds or the cost. She and Jonah had defended not just their property, but their right to choose where and how they lived. In doing so, they had discovered that their marriage of convenience had become something deeper and more enduring than either of them had dared to hope. The soil in her hand represented their shared future, hard-won and precious, beyond any monetary value that developers might place on it. As they watched federal authorities move to arrest the men who had tried to steal their home, both Jonah and Hester understood that they had won more than just a legal victory. They had won the right to build a life together on ground that was truly their own. 6 months later, Jonah and Hester stood together on the foundation stones of their new cabin, watching the sun rise over mountains that belonged to them in ways that no deed or survey could fully capture. The legal battles had been concluded with surprising swiftness once federal authorities began examining the evidence they had provided. Cornelius Blackwood and his associates were serving prison sentences that would keep them away from other people's property for many years to come. The Rocky Mountain Development Corporation had been dissolved, its assets seized to provide compensation for the farmers and homesteaders who had been defrauded out of their land. Hester's original farm had been restored to her ownership, along with damages that reflected its true value rather than the artificially depressed price the bank had been willing to accept. But more important than the legal vindication was the transformation that had occurred in their relationship during the months of struggle and victory. What had begun as a marriage of convenience between 2 desperate strangers had evolved into a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and hard-earned trust. "Do you ever regret it?" Hester asked, as they watched their neighbors arrive to help with the cabin raising that would replace the humble line shack where their marriage had begun. "Regret what?" Jonah replied, though he suspected he knew what she meant. "Stopping that night on the bridge, taking in a stranger who brought nothing but trouble into your peaceful life." Jonah considered the question seriously, as he had learned to consider most things since Hester had become part of his world. His life before that night seemed like something that had happened to a different person, a man so wounded by loss that he had forgotten how to hope for anything better than mere survival. "I regret that it took me so long to understand what Martha was trying to tell me," he said finally, "about remembering how to live, and not letting grief become an excuse for giving up on everything that makes life worth living." Their new cabin would be larger than the line shack, with proper windows and a stone fireplace that would heat multiple rooms. But more than size or comfort, it would be built with the participation of a community that had come to see Jonah and Hester as symbols of what ordinary people could accomplish when they refused to be intimidated by wealth and power. Heinrich Müller arrived first, as he had for every day of the construction project, bringing his considerable skills as a carpenter and his dry German humor that had become an essential part of their extended family. Behind him came Mary Pemberton, Jake Morrison, Tom Chen, and half a dozen other neighbors who had chosen to stand with them during the darkest days of the conflict. "Foundation looks solid," Heinrich observed, running his hands over the carefully fitted stones that would support their new home. "Should last for generations, assuming you two can manage to stay out of trouble long enough to enjoy it." "We'll do our best," Hester replied with a smile that suggested she wasn't entirely convinced they would succeed. As the work began, with neighbors organizing themselves into teams responsible for different aspects of the construction, Jonah found himself marveling at the sense of community that had emerged from their struggle against the development consortium. People who had barely known each other before the crisis had been forced to work together, and in doing so had discovered the satisfaction that came from defending something worth preserving. The cabin they were building would stand as more than just a hermit, would be a monument to the principle that ordinary people could resist organized greed when they had the courage to stand together. Every beam that was raised, every board that was nailed, every stone that was fitted into place represented a choice to build rather than to destroy, to create rather than to exploit. By midday, the walls were beginning to take shape, and the women had organized a feast that transformed the construction site into something approaching a celebration. Children played in the meadow, where Jonah had once sat alone, and their laughter filled spaces that had been empty for too long. "Look at that," Hester said, pointing to where Tom Chen's young son was teaching Heinrich's grandson how to skip stones in the stream that ran past their property. A year ago, none of these people would have had reason to know each other. "Funny how shared danger can create friendships that wouldn't have existed otherwise," Jonah observed. "Or marriages," Hester added with a meaningful look. As the afternoon wore on and the cabin's frame took shape under the combined efforts of their neighbors, both Jonah and Hester found themselves thinking about the bridge where they had first met. The wooden structure still stood where it had always stood, spanning the same rushing water that had promised to carry away all of Hester's troubles on that desperate night. But now the bridge served a different purpose in their shared mythology. Instead of representing an ending, it had become a symbol of transformation, the place where two broken lives had intersected and created something stronger than either could have achieved alone. "I want to go there tonight," Hester said as the construction work wound down and their neighbors began preparing for the journey back to their own homes. "To the bridge. I want to see it again with different eyes." "Together?" Jonah asked. "Together," she confirmed. They made the journey as the sun was setting, following the familiar trail that connected their valley to the wider world beyond. The bridge looked exactly as it had on that night months earlier, weathered wood, spanning fast-moving water, solid enough to support travelers, but humble enough to be easily overlooked by those who had no reason to stop. Standing where she had once contemplated ending her life, Hester marveled at the chain of events that had brought her to this moment. The desperate woman who had gripped the bridge's rail with white knuckles was gone, replaced by someone who understood that even the deepest despair could be transformed into hope with the right combination of courage and companionship. "Do you think we would have found each other if circumstances had been different?" she asked. "I don't know," Jonah replied honestly, "but I'm grateful we don't have to find out." They stood together in the gathering darkness, listening to the sound of water that had once promised escape, but now spoke of continuity and renewal. The stream would continue to flow long after they were gone, carrying snowmelt from the high peaks to valleys and plains beyond their knowledge or concern. But for now, it flowed past their land, their home, their shared life that had been built from the remnants of dreams that had seemed impossible just a few months earlier. The foundation stones of their new cabin would endure, But more importantly, the foundation of their partnership had been tested by forces that might have destroyed a less resilient bond. As they prepared to return to the cabin where their neighbors were banking the fires and settling in for the night, Hester reached down and picked up a handful of soil from the bank of the stream. The earth was rich and dark, nourished by mountain water and countless seasons of growth and renewal. "For our garden," she said, tucking the soil into her pocket. "Something to remember this moment by." Jonah nodded, understanding that the soil represented more than just earth for planting. It was a symbol of their commitment to building something lasting in a place they had chosen to defend against all odds. The cabin they were constructing would shelter them through the winters to come, but the true foundation of their life together was built from choices they had made about what was worth fighting for and what was worth preserving. Walking back through the darkness, toward the light that beckoned from their valley, both Jonah and Hester knew that they had found something that no amount of money or power could purchase. A home that belonged to them not just legally, but spiritually, and a partnership that had been forged in the crucible of shared adversity. The lonely cowboy who had rescued a starving woman from a bridge had discovered that salvation was a mutual enterprise, requiring both the courage to extend help and the wisdom to accept it when offered. Their marriage had begun as a matter of necessity and convenience, but it had evolved into something that neither of them had dared to hope for. A love story written in the language of shared struggle and mutual respect. As they reached their valley and saw the warm light spilling from the windows of the cabin that would soon be their permanent home, Hester realized that she no longer carried Thomas's locket close to her heart. The small silver pendant now rested in a place of honor on their mantle, a memorial to love that had been lost, but also a blessing on love that had been found. The foundation stones they had laid together would support more than just walls and roof. They would anchor a life built on the understanding that true partnership required both people to be strong enough to stand alone and wise enough to choose not to. In choosing each other, they had also chosen hope over despair, community over isolation, and the future over the past. The handful of soil in Hester's pocket would nurture the garden they would plant come spring, just as the seeds of their unlikely romance had taken root in ground that had seemed too hard and cold to support new growth. But love, like the hardy mountain flowers that bloomed in the briefest summers, could flourish in the most unlikely places when tended with patience and care. Their story had begun with a desperate woman on a bridge and a hermit who chose compassion over indifference. It would continue with two partners, building a life that honored both their losses and their hopes, in a valley where rushing water spoke not of endings, but of eternal renewal. The foundation was solid, the future was bright, and together they were finally home.